I've just finished reading the second novel on my fall personal curriculum in Gothic literature. This was The Monk by Matthew Lewis, published 1790 something. It was about as wild as everyone warned me it would be. Gotta love a plot twist on the last page. This book had a lot of plot. There was a lot that happened in this novel. And now that I've finished reading it, my next step is to write up some notes about the novel. So I figured I would make a video documenting what that note-taking process of mine looks like. It's not very formal, it's not even very formulaic, the kinds of notes that I'm taking. I'm just using my note-taking as a way to engage more with the texts, make sure that I am kind of locking in what I think about them in the immediate aftermath of reading them, and then giving myself some time to write reflectively and generatively about what kinds of ideas are occurring to me as I'm reading through a novel, what connections I'm seeing between one novel and another literary text I've read before, or just an idea, or just, anything that occurs to me. I'm pretty unsophisticated and low-tech about this. I just have one Microsoft Word document that I'm taking all my notes in throughout this personal curriculum, and I'm using headers in Microsoft Word so that I can have a navigation pane open and jump to different sections of my document. And I'm also mostly dictating my notes rather than typing them, which is partly just a habit I've gotten into as a result of having some repetitive stress injuries that flare up if I type too much. But it's also a practice that I have grown to appreciate as a way to help my thoughts flow more easily and kind of engage with my ideas in a different medium. I find that dictating rather than just writing, rather than having everything be silent and in my head, helps me think in a different way. I'm just gonna jump in right now to my note-taking and get started with a little bit of a plot synopsis while it's still fresh in my mind so that I can talk through that, get it down on paper, and have that logged in my notes document. I read this novel just as a PDF on my iPad, and so I have that annotated, marked up PDF of things that I highlighted or little ideas that I scribbled in the margins. So I'll have that open as I'm writing down or dictating down my plot synopsis so that I can refresh my memory, not just of what happened, but what I thought about what happened as I was reading it. And then once I've got that plot synopsis down, we'll go from there. I'll take you with me on my note-taking process. And along the way of talking about this, I definitely will talk about specifics of the novel as well. So this won't be a spoiler-free video about The Monk. This is your warning. But the focus here is definitely less on just the plot of The Monk itself and more about my approach to note-taking and my strategies for engaging with the text now after I've read it. I've got my ceramic stein of Earl Grey the size of my head to fuel me through this, so without further ado, let's take some notes. He has a fear that because he has never been tested or exposed to any sins, he could be fallible. Hello everybody, this is a warning that coming up at around the 9-minute mark, I make a reference to sexual violence in this novel, and I'm going to return to the topic a couple more times over the course of this video. I don't talk about it in any detailed way or even in all that substantial of a way, but if this is a topic that's unsafe for you to engage with, please be aware that it is something I'm going to mention a few times from here on out. How Lewis is framing. I wanted to write a plot summary. I started writing it, and there's truly so much that goes on in this novel. And so I'm starting it and I'm like, okay, so there's a monk in Madrid and he's very famous for being so incorruptible, and he's never left the monastery walls ever since being dropped there as a child. And then we're going to see this monk speak, and there's two young men sitting there, and then a woman walks in, and that woman, so it turns out that that woman is the sister of this woman Elvira, and it's just too much going on I would have had to like write pages on pages of notes to actually write down plot point by plot point what happens in this book. So I pivoted once I'd started, and I wrote a couple of descriptions of the main characters, and in my descriptions I covered briefly some of the important things that happen to them, kind of like their individual character plot arcs. Really, the purpose of me writing the plot summary is just to help me remember, because I have a pretty poor memory. So writing or dictating what happens in the novel helps it stick in my mind. And then obviously if I ever return to those notes and it's been a while since I read the text, it's helpful for me to refresh my memory. But I can get that done with doing this kind of approach of just describing some of the major things that happen to the major characters rather than getting bogged down in getting every detail right. I got down my major character descriptions, and then I made a little list of what some of the supernatural elements in this novel were, because that is one of the things that I'm interested in tracking across all the Gothic novels I'm reading. There were some really fun supernatural elements in this novel, and I should make a note of this as well, actually. The supernatural elements didn't start until a decent way into the novel, as opposed to in Castle of Otranto, where like the second page, a giant helmet falls out of the sky and smushes someone to death. With this one, at first, it's very much just focusing on realism and the lives of these characters and establishing a mood, and then we start introducing some spookier elements, ghosts and devils and things like that. I'm gonna add that note into my document now. Anyway, after I'd finished those more plot level basic recording of facts notes, I moved on to writing some notes on one part of this novel that I found really interesting as I was reading through it, which was that every chapter started with an epigraph. And that's definitely not unusual for an 18th century novel, you know, to have every chapter opening with a different quote from a different literary text. It started to catch my eye as I was reading through, because I was noticing that a lot of the epigraphs were from Shakespeare. And at first I had to think like, wait a minute, are these all from Shakespeare? They're not. There were, I think, five quotes from Shakespeare, but one of them is just a quote from Othello embedded into a chapter. But 4 of the epigraphs for the chapters are from Shakespeare plays. We have Cymbeline, Macbeth, Measure for Measure, and Two Gentlemen of Verona. I wanted to make a list of what all the epigraphs were, just so that I could have them in one place and kind of look at them as a group and think about what they are suggesting as a whole, if anything. For the most part, the epigraphs seem to be functioning almost like foreshadowing. For example, in a chapter that begins with an epigraph from Macbeth, quoting from the lines in which Macbeth is looking at the ghost of Banquo, that chapter that follows ends up having a ghost in it. Or in the chapter that begins with a quote from Cymbeline, the quote makes reference to Tarquin and is from a passage in Cymbeline where a man is sneaking into a woman's bedroom while she sleeps. And that chapter ends up depicting Ambrosio, the evil monk, using a branch given to him by Satan that was enchanted to open any door and also have the power to put the woman he is obsessed with into an unwaking sleep. And so Ambrosio uses the date rape branch to send the object of his affections to sleep so that he can assault her. He's interrupted that time. So, you know, I was recording all these epigraphs, making some notes on them, thinking about them, trying to search down the ones that were unfamiliar to me. One of the ones that was unfamiliar to me was a poem by Pope that I didn't know before, and I had to Google the quote to find the poem, which is from a Pope poem called Imitations of Horace. And it's a long poem, and I didn't read the whole thing, but it seems to be about great authors and how the reputation of great authors is kind of solidified by the passage of time. There's one quote from the beginning of the poem that I really liked, and it is, quote, "Authors, like coins, grow dear as they grow old. It is the rust we value, not the gold." And from there he goes on to talk about how in his day as he's writing, Chaucer is being taught in schools and memorized as great literature, even though it's very bawdy, very kind of low humor, but with the passage of time, it grows into something impressive, and that the rust on the coin is what is being valued, I think is a really interesting image. And that poem also, I hadn't realized when I was first reading it, but that poem serves as the epigraph to the entire book. In addition to there being epigraphs on each chapter, there is an epigraph to the book itself, and it is a longer passage out of this poem, Imitations of Horace. And that makes me think that the epigraphs in general are kind of intentionally positioning this book, The Monk, amongst some great authors like Shakespeare, and that maybe there's a little bit of self-awareness for Matthew Lewis writing The Monk, that this novel maybe won't be received as Shakespeare, maybe won't be received as like one of the great pieces of literature of its time, but that as time goes on, it might accumulate more respect or more importance because of the rust on the gold adding more value to the coin. I guess whether it was Matthew Lewis's intention isn't the most important thing, or even the most interesting thing to me. I mean, here I am in 2025 sitting and reading The Monk, not because it's considered to be one of the greatest works of literature of all time, but just because it is an old novel, that it's an early form of this genre that I'm curious about. Anyway, in terms of me kind of thinking strategically about my approach to taking these notes, the list of epigraphs and my research, light research, and note-taking on that was really a way for me to partly review the book, because I had to go back through each chapter to look at the epigraphs, and then it was helping me to think about positioning the novel in relation to other texts that it's in conversation with. And I was really embracing tangents as I was researching as well, like if there was an author whose work was being used in an epigraph who I hadn't heard of, I'm going to go on that author's Wikipedia page and see a little bit about what's up. And that's a part of the research and reading process that I really enjoy, is just going on those tangents. And some of them lead to dead ends. Some of them lead to little ideas occurring to me that I don't think I'll do anything with, but they're interesting. One of the epigraphs was the work of a 16th century Italian poet I had never heard of, but in Googling him, I found one collection of his poetry that had a poem about Tarquin and Lucrece, which is a rape narrative, and one that Shakespeare adapted famously as well into a narrative poem. And so I made note of that. Is it going to connect to anything? I don't know, but it sparked not even an idea really, but just me going, that's interesting. And anytime I have the thought, oh, that's interesting, I put it down in my note document. But the last thing I'm going to do in taking my notes on this novel is to work a little bit with a couple of the research questions I set for myself when I was first making my personal curriculum. I had a couple research questions about my interest in just the core elements of the Gothic genre and how that evolves and is adapted over time. And then I had two different subject-specific research questions, one of which is that I want to dig into a bit how gender and sex is presented across a range of Gothic texts, and I'm interested in how hospitality and the home are presented as well. This novel ended up being a really rich text for digging into both those questions, so I'm also going to spend some time writing through some thoughts about that. I'm gonna do just some dictating, stream of conscious, maybe pull some quotes from the novel itself to stick into my Word document and see what comes out of it. That was fun, and that felt really productive, actually. The thoughts were flowing, the dots were connecting. I really do feel like dictating my thoughts out, and even now, talking to the camera about my thoughts helps me so much to process a novel. I think that as I was dictating my notes just now, thoughts were occurring to me that I don't know if would have if I were just typing them out. There were a couple times when I would be talking and then in the middle of the sentence I would remember something else from a different point in the book. Once again, in my notes just now, I basically was starting with just lists and then from there moved on to a little bit more reflection and analysis. So when I was writing my notes on how sex functions in the novel, I started by just making a list of basically characters who have sex, the different sexual relationships that exist in this novel, of which there are many, and all of them have negative consequences. But as I was listing out what those relationships are and what the negative consequences are, I was noticing that there is a fair amount of nuance and an importance of the distinctions between types of sexual transgression. It felt like one of the big contrasts there was between the character Ambrosio, the monk who breaks his vows of chastity, and the character Agnes, who is a nun who breaks her vows of chastity. But whereas Ambrosio breaks it and then spirals out into a series of poor decisions and ultimately violent decisions, really violent actions, all the way up to and including rape and murder. In contrast, Agnes has a sexual relationship with the man who she intended to marry before she had joined the convent, and fate split them apart. And the product of her lapse in judgment and her decision to have sex with him while she was still in the convent led to her becoming pregnant, and that led to some genuinely horrific consequences that some really messed up stuff happens to Agnes, and some descriptions of decaying corpses that I think are going to stick with me for a while to come. But the distinction here is that Ambrosio falls into violence and really horrible acts, and he ends up damned. Whereas Agnes makes an understandable decision that has negative consequences. You know, she is in love with this man. She wanted to marry him. It is, within the context of this novel, irresponsible for her to have sex with him. But ultimately, she survives and is able to marry this man and go on to have a life with him and presumably have children with him, although the child that was a result of their first time together does not survive. Graphically does not survive. Oh my God. Ultimately, in the past couple of hours, I ended up taking about 6 pages of notes, and again, those were mostly just discussion and me kind of processing my ideas, starting to draw some connections. But the purpose of this note-taking was just to engage more with the text, work out what my ideas are, kind of clarify to myself what I think about the plot and the characters and these themes that I'm tracking of the supernatural elements and sex and gender and hospitality. I don't intend to write any more notes on this novel specifically, but this is the last novel that I had assigned myself to read in full during this month, and there's still over a week of September left, and that means that I will do some more note-taking, I think, and that note-taking will probably just be me continuing to workshop my ideas, maybe write a little bit about Otranto in connection with the monk, maybe pursue some of those tangents that I was starting to go down when I was researching the epigraphs, maybe do a little bit more writing and thinking about how Shakespeare is influencing the Gothic based on what I've read so far. It's all freeform, it's all unstructured, but it's also all productive, because anytime you sit down and you write through your ideas about something, you lock them into place, you clarify them for yourself, and you come up with a whole new list of things to think about. This was a great couple hours of note-taking, honestly. It was very productive and it was fun. I had a good time. So far, my Gothic Lit curriculum is taking me to really interesting places.